Good morning everyone, and thank you for attending today's presentation on security. My name is Mark Allford and I'm the Cloud Solutions Architect for Circle. And today I'm going to be taking you through the security section of this event, where we're going to be talking about the concepts of security and how to protect your data, understanding your security posture within your organisation, and how we eliminate and eradicate the risk of data leakage across the organisation. Now we're going to try and keep this as technology agnostic as possible, although we will make some recommendations throughout. But the purpose of this session is for us to kind of give you an overview of how all of this fits together with the evolving technology landscape that we find ourselves trying to manage day in, day out. So the first thing I'd like to cover off is that technology landscape, because in a nutshell, where a lot of organisations have grown organically, there are a number of things within that environment that you have to manage, and traditionally they've all been very scattered. There are legacy platforms in play, there's kind of traditional back office functions which don't lend themselves very well to a more modern approach, and then lastly we kind of have a lot of fragmented endpoint solutions. Now when we talk about these systems and services within an organisation, they essentially have many areas of management. They do very different things for very good reasons, but to bring a modern workplace and secure environment with the landscape that we now find ourselves in, with people remote working predominantly as a result of COVID, things have to change in order to keep up. And particularly with a lot of organisations now moving towards the cloud as well, these things have to keep pace and evolve with that changing landscape. Now we can also talk about the security layers that we have within an organisation, and they all essentially stem from the user, and particularly when we're looking at cloud infrastructure services or Office 365 as an example. The user is that single identity that is responsible for gaining access into that environment. Everything forms around that user. Without that user's credentials, it's very, very difficult for anybody to circumvent the security layers within a public cloud environment. So if you look at that in context of what we used to see from a user's security standpoint, that has always historically been just a password management system. Then we look at the device, and you'd have your historical antivirus services. Your infrastructure would have kind of your kind of standard server security and hardening in play. Your network would be segmented into VLANs and have user-based security on there as well. Then you'd have everything within your perimeter, and you'd have your firewall typically securing that. And as things have evolved and matured as well, we've also had to add in the service providers. So people like us, as an example, that provide services to a lot of organisations, there needs to be security practices in play by those organisations to ensure that the integrity of the security within your own organisation is also maintained. Now that landscape has moved on an awful lot. So when we ask you about how you protect your data within your organisation, it's something to think about, is that these are just some of the data points that we use to map out an organisation's security maturity. Now when we look at things like this, there are standard or legacy/traditional methods in here around data encryption, system updates, and user accounts you would typically secure. But now we're adding into this a lot more services that need to form the baseline of what your security looks like within any organisation. Now when we look at the identity side of things within your organisation, I'd like you to ask yourselves these questions as you go through. So when we look at identity specifically, do you know who is accessing your data? Can you grant access to your data based on risk in real time? Can you quickly find and react to a breach? And are users empowered to work securely anywhere at any time? So if we look at the first column within this slide, do you know who's accessing your data? And traditionally when your data was on premises, that was a fairly easy one to answer. But as we move on, a lot of the data now has moved into public cloud services. Now, whether that's Office 365 or G Suite or some other cloud hosting service that you may be using, it's a lot more difficult to understand who is accessing that data if you're not doing the fundamentals within your user security. So I'll give an example for that. If you don't have multi-factor authentication enabled for your users, how do you know it is actually that user that's connecting in and somebody hasn't managed to get hold of those credentials and are perpetrating to be that user? Can you grant access to your data based on risk in real time? That lends itself more so to the capability of those credentials being phished and somebody accessing that information from another location that was impossible to travel to based on the last login location of that particular user as well. So if somebody logged in at 10 AM from the UK and then logged in China at 10:05, that's physically impossible to be able to travel between those two locations unless you use VPN services and things like that. So we want to be able to contextualize and grant access based on that real-time access request and be able to block that, more importantly, as well. So what we're seeing a lot of now is conversations around how we protect that identity. And there's multiple solutions on the marketplace that allow you to do this. So that could be your standard Active Directory, it could be multi-factor authentication services, it can be Office 365 or Microsoft 365 services. There are a number of safeguards that you can put in place and applications that will enable you to do as such. So if we look at most of the security breaches, most of those occur when attackers steal a user's identity. Once an attacker hacks even a low privileged user account, it's relatively easy for them to gain access to important company resources through lateral movement. Think about what gaps you have and how you can protect identities and proactively prevent compromised identities from being used. There are also services available where organisations can define policies and alerts which learn about cloud usage in that organisation, manage apps and get information needed to learn, analyse and identify suspicious users or device behaviour. This is particularly important where people are remote working as the norm and the edge of the network is further away than ever before. So that firewall scenario where everybody used to access your content and services through that firewall now no longer exists, and the data is moving further and further away from that centralised environment. And for passwords, password-based protection exposes businesses to risky user behaviour. So those types of things include recycled and easily hacked passwords. So if you don't have a password policy in play, or if you have a legacy password policy in play, and by legacy those are typically please ask your users to change their password every 90 days, that is typically seen as legacy and old school methods of doing password protection. And the recommended guidelines now are to have multi-factor authentication in place as standard and to actually not ask your users to change their password, but to make that password a lot more complex in the first instance and protect all services with MFA. Now I appreciate that isn't always possible in every instance, but that is something to consider as you answer these questions for your own organisation's security maturity. So we take that forward and we look at what that modern workplace looks like for today, and there are calls for modern workplace verification tools such as the MFA, as I mentioned, and you include that then with your device management platform to confirm that it is really them even though they are using MFA. And that is something that needs to be considered as a baseline for all organisations going forward. Now we move on to data. So we've just covered user identities, now let's talk about that data. So is your data secured regardless of where it's stored or shared? Does a data compliance policy control access to sensitive information? Can you classify and encrypt that data? And how can you essentially respond to GDPR or subject access requests? Now when we talk about these, I get asked an awful lot, particularly around the subject access requests, on how easy they are to deliver. And that's from organisations that are still predominantly on premises and their files and folders are on standard file shares. Now when we talk about that experience where it's on premises, that is a very arduous and laborious process to go through, and that's if you can still manage to obtain all of that information. That is typically somebody's job to respond to those subject access requests, and it's quite painful. If this moves into a modern workplace type scenario where it's utilising Office 365 for example, and your data for the organisation is predominantly held in SharePoint, Exchange Online, OneDrive and Teams, then we have the capability of doing an e-discovery function which will return the results of the search criteria requested within a matter of minutes. That enables you to very quickly free up the time and resources that you would typically have allocated to this and move that person's role and responsibility into doing something a lot more impacting for the business as opposed to fulfilling that subject access request. How do we control and protect the information within your organisation? Particularly, again, I know it's probably been drummed into everybody now time and time again, but the fact is most organisations can't work in the office now, or they shouldn't work in the office due to the government restrictions. So there's a requirement for them to enable people to work from home. So today's organisations require the security of an on-premise system for cloud applications, both approved and unapproved, for deeper visibility. And those comprehensive controls and enhanced protections against cloud security issues need to leverage themselves to that new way of working. So to put that into perspective, when we're talking about users' data, the concept of that user's data and that work that they have to do, if that's on a traditional file share in your office environment that users have to VPN over to access that data, what's in place to stop them copying that data locally or to send themselves an email, which we've seen time and time again, so that they can work on it outside of the VPN. Now as soon as that happens, the organisation has lost control of that data. So it's very important to make sure that the right controls and restrictions are in place to enable people to do what they need to do effectively, but also with the right security in place. And when we talk about data leakage, we need the control over the access to information, no matter where it's stored, to emphasise my point, and who it's shared with. If you share information via a traditional method of sending it via email, once that's sent via email, that information is then in the hands of whomever you've sent that to. With modern capabilities, we can enable the sharing of information via traditional methods, shall we say, which will enable you to still control access to that data for that particular user. So that user can't forward on that email that they've just received with very sensitive information they probably shouldn't have access to another recipient. This would all be based on that user's credentials and guest level access. Now that is very, very important for a lot of organisations whereby data leakage is of a very real concern, as it is for most organisations in the main. One of the other risks for data security is the risk of malicious attacks. So if we're trying to protect against malware and phishing attempts, there are new malware variants that arise every day, creating a need to help protect kind of organisations, mailboxes as well as devices against those sophisticated attacks in real time. Now having a third-party solution in place, whether that's Microsoft, Mimecast or so on, this will give you an additional layer of protection to ensure that your users are protected, because these phishing attempts these days are very, very sophisticated, and in some instances they even utilise 365 web pages, if you will, or very look-alike web pages that perpetrate to be the official 365 login, and they will attempt to steal those phishing attempts, credentials, in order to be able to perpetrate as that user. Now, if those types of attempts happened and the credentials were successfully phished, then how do you respond to that? Have you, within your organisation, thought about your response and detection methods to ensure that that issue has been resolved and the threat has been eradicated? It's not just good enough to change that user's username, password now, because if there has been lateral movement within that account and they've managed to successfully gain control over another account, how do you make sure that that threat has been eradicated? Are there tool sets within your organisation that enable you to do this effectively and swiftly to ensure that nothing else occurs within your environment? And to that point, are there tools in place that allow you to automatically detect high risk usage? So it's not good enough these days just to have tool sets that report on event logs, which again goes back to my comment around traditional services. Modern tool sets now use machine learning to be able to detect and prevent these eventualities. That is critical in being able to respond swiftly and identify action which is outside of the norm. So one of the recommendations for us off the back of this is to proactively conduct a risk assessment of your organisation's security maturity. Now, that assessment will help you understand the risk and formulate a plan on what you need to do to identify and resolve the gaps that may be in that risk assessment. There are many tool sets out there that allow you to do this. Microsoft have them. There's tool sets by Splunk or Logarithm and things like that. There are lots of different tool sets out there that have the machine learning capabilities built into them. But the very first step I would advise you to do is conduct that risk assessment if you haven't already. And if you already have, perhaps some of the questions that we've covered off today may be of benefit to introduce into the risk assessment process that you've already got, to ask yourselves those questions and to update it if it hasn't already been updated as a result of people now predominantly working remotely. So to summarise what we've talked about today, we've covered off a lot of the different areas, particularly around identity and access management, the information protection policies and that threat protection, that will hopefully give you some food for thought on how to mitigate any issues in the future. Now, all of this, I will add, is a layered approach. There is no one item within a security model that will give you the silver bullet, unfortunately. So there is a very layered approach in terms of that security. There is no point in just protecting users' identity and access management, because if that gets compromised or there's any other malicious way into your organisation and they circumvent that user's security, then there needs to be additional services out there that protect the organisation. Now, it would be remiss of me not to kind of mention one of the product sets out there, and given our experience in housing associations to date, a lot of the housing associations we deal with are utilising Microsoft 365 product sets. Now, Microsoft 365 has solutions to be able to address a lot of these categories. So if we look at the identity and access management, we've got things like Azure Active Directory, which has MFA and conditional access built into it. Then we have the threat protection, where we've got 365 advanced threat protection for email and mail washing. We've got Windows Defender, which could replace your current antivirus solutions. We've then got Azure Information Protection, which is all around document encryption and security, and so on. There's a lot of products within different license types that can help achieve a very good security posture within your organisation. And to sum up, these are just some stats that we have from Microsoft on how their threat detection system and security software enables them to provide an industry-leading service to all of their customers. So if you're interested in discussing this any further, please get in touch.
Thank you for joining us for today's event. We hope you enjoyed the talks and have had some useful takeaways from the discussions. If you have any further questions and would like to speak to one of our experts in more depth, please get in touch and we'd be happy to answer any further questions you have. Thank you.